Hey everybody, this lecture today is going to be on ethics, and this week we're focusing on the sort of second stage of life, in particular, what it's like to be a child or to raise a child, and what to do when it comes to raising a child ethically. In this first lecture for this week, we're going to be discussing Aristotle's virtue ethics and just virtue in general. So there's sort of two initial fundamental questions that we should be thinking about and asking, both from an ethical point of view and something like a bioethical point of view, when it comes to thinking about like how to ethically treat children. And when it comes to the kinds of things that each of us are actually going to experience in our lives, right? So not necessarily all of you will end up going on to practice in any kind of medical field, but many, if not most of you, will end up having to interact with or raise children at some point. And so it's worth thinking about how we ought to raise children, and how we should try to teach children to be ethical. And so there's a lot of things that are worth asking or thinking about along the lines of these questions, right? So if you just take the question, how should we raise children? There's a lot baked in there, namely, like what is the purpose of raising children? Are we supposed to be raising children to be model members of our society? But what is, like, maybe, but what is the point of that? Like, why do we need our children to be model members of society? What's the good of having such a society? Are we better or worse off for raising children with or under certain purposes? Are there better and worse ways of raising children? And are those ways, are some of them ethical and are some of them unethical? I mean, I think that seems rather clear that there are clearly unethical ways of raising children. Abandoning children is a problem, is definitely something that's unethical, but raising children in horrific environments or abusing children always are problematic. And then on top of that, so we've got this other question, like how is it that we should teach children to be good, to be ethical, to be moral? Is it best in some way to try and teach them actual ethical theory, teaching them the difference between right and wrong? Or is it better in some sense to model being a good person for them so that they, in a sense, just learn by emulation, by acting? And what does it take to do either of these things, right? Like, what do you have to do in order to get a child to be motivated to emulate you as you act well? Or what do you have to get to have a child be, able to understand you when you're trying to teach them what is right from what is wrong? Well, at the very least, sort of, and the other purpose of this week is to try and think about, maybe attempt at answering some of these questions through the vein or lens of three classic ethical theories that have been probably the most popular normative ethical theories of the last at least century, and then reaching back quite a long ways. And these three theories are virtue ethics, utilitarianism, and deontology. Each of these has sort of a main proponent that is often associated with them in a way, and one of that are most famous. Aristotle, ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, is sort of the originator of virtue ethics. Utilitarianism, one of the main proponents of that view was John Stuart Mill, and deontology was proposed, sort of in its most distilled form, by Immanuel Kant. Now, each of these theories is rather different, but they each also try to kind of capture what we already know. That is, they try to explain and distill the sort of why question behind things that we already intuitively know to be right and wrong. Each of these views, in a sense, starts from our already, our already had moral knowledge, our already had, it's clear to us what kinds of things, at least in the extreme cases, are right and wrong. Things like, murder, torturing puppies for fun, rape. We know which kinds of things are wrong. We know which kinds of things are right too, right? Like, treating people with respect, giving to each other what is due, not cheating one another. These kinds of things we know to be good. And given that we know that these are good and that these are bad, there's an interesting sort of question, like, what explains why these things are good and that these things are bad? It seems, at least on the surface, that there's some kind of unifying features of things that are good and of things that are bad. And insofar as there are these unifying features, right, things that, features that make certain activities always wrong or always right, we should be able to come up with some kind of underlying theory. And each of these classical theories tries to give a set of answers to those questions. Today, we're going to start off with by discussing Aristotle and Aristotelian virtue ethics. So just to begin, Aristotle was an ancient Greek philosopher and scientist, possibly one of the most famous, apart from Plato and Socrates, who were Aristotle's predecessors. Aristotle is namely famous for being the teacher of Alexander the Great, who conquered an entire large chunk of the ancient world. And Aristotle was his sort of tutor, and helped raise him to be the kind of great person that he ended up becoming. Aristotle would try in his lifetime to sort of systematically organize most of the knowledge that was available at the time. He was definitely one of those people that, it's funny to think about. At a certain point in time, it was possible for individuals to actually kind of know everything that there was to know at a time. And Aristotle is definitely one of those guys. He knew everything that there was to know in the ancient Greek realm, and he wrote on all of it and sort of helped to systematize much of it. And so there are lots and lots of things that Aristotle wrote on, from biology to physics to all kinds of ethics and philosophy. He also supposedly wrote some dialogues, kind of like plays, many of which, though, I think for the most, all of which are lost to antiquity. I think a lot of the stuff that he wrote was actually just burned in the loss of the Library of Alexandria, which is a great loss. Most of Western philosophy can, in some sense, be traced back through Aristotelian thought. In basically, Aristotle's writings and teachings were famous, back then, and then were saved mainly through Islamic philosophers and Islamic libraries. And then the Aristotelian writings kind of worked their way back into the Western canon through early Christianity and early kind of ways of thinking along those lines. And then ultimately, I think in the Middle Ages, we have Sir Thomas Aquinas, Saint Thomas Aquinas, in the Catholic Church, that actually kind of combined Aristotelian thinking with the fundamentals or foundations of Christian thinking, in order to come up with something that ultimately now looks a lot like the kind of general metaphysical theory that you would find in Catholic theology. But Aristotle's sort of early book, or sort of his book on ethics, which is a little bit different and not the same kinds of things that you find in Catholic theology, is of much interest, and it's called the Nicomachean Ethics. And it's sort of helpful in a way, I think, to think of the Nicomachean Ethics as having to do with raising or rearing of children, because Nicomacheus was both, not both, but the name was Aristotle's son. It was also the name of Aristotle's father. So this sort of book seems like aptly named, insofar as either he seemed to have chosen to name it as a dedication to his son or to his father. So where are we going with this? I mean, so to begin with, we can ask this kind of question. What is the good? What is goodness? What is it for something to be good? What kinds of things are good? And we're not talking here about, the good, from the good, the bad, and the ugly here, Clint Eastwood. No, but like we're asking, what kind of a thing? This is an abstract philosophical question. What kind of a thing is goodness? How can we understand what kind of thing goodness is? What kinds of things are good and why? What explains how it can be that, you can have a good car and you can have a good meal? Like, what's the thing that's the same between them, right? It's not the case that like this word is supposed to mean something. What's the meaning of this word goodness such that it applies in such a crazy different way, but still means the same thing to, different kinds of things? It's really hard to see how there could be some kind of straightforward answer to this kind of question, right? It seems so out there when you ask, like, well, what is it that makes a car good? What is it that makes a meal good? What is it that makes a person good? What is it that makes, a hammer or a knife good, or a good day or a good night's sleep? How could these things possibly share anything? This may be just one of those words that just kind of means everything. And so we don't have any, we shouldn't be thinking, we shouldn't be seeking out some unifying theory of what goodness is. Aristotle will have nothing to do with that. He thinks that he has an answer to the question, what is good? For Aristotle, goodness is relative, and it's relative to the purpose a thing has. And so this, in general, is kind of an outline of his theory of goodness and how we can understand what it is for a thing to be good, and how we can understand what it is for, like for things in general to be good. And the first sort of example that he gives in his Nicomachean Ethics is that of a knife. So what is it that makes a knife good? Well, the knife has to be sharp, right? It has to be sharp, but why does it have to be sharp, right? I mean, if you've got a knife hanging on a wall as a display piece, it doesn't need to be sharp at all. So what would it be a bad knife if it were not sharp and hanging on a wall? Well, no, but that kind of knife doesn't do the kind of thing that we normally think of a good knife as being able to do, right? If you've got a knife hanging on a wall as a display piece, you don't need it to be sharp. So why do we normally think of knives needing to be sharp as the goodness making feature of a knife? Well, it has to do with the fact that the purpose of a knife is to do a very specific kind of thing, right? It's to cut. Knives cut things. And because knives cut things, we understand what counts as a good knife in virtue of understanding what makes it good at cutting. And sharpness is the kind of thing that makes a knife good at cutting. There are other things that make a knife good at cutting, right? It needs to have a handle. If a knife doesn't have a handle, it's not going to be very functional. It's not going to be very good for cutting. It needs to, be such that the handle itself isn't sharp, right? So that you can actually hold it. It needs to not be so flimsy that it falls apart, or that it, bends too much while trying to cut. These are all things that are features, that are good making features of a knife, insofar as they help the knife perform its function, serve its purpose, the purpose of cutting. So now we can think in a way of goodness as relating to what we might think of as the virtues of a thing with respect to the purpose of that thing. And so if you want to figure out what goodness is, you need to recognize that goodness only applies. There is no, like, at least on the Aristotelian view, goodness itself, right? There's no just like, object that is goodness. There's no abstract Platonic form that is called the good. Instead, what there is there's this relative notion of goodness that attaches to things understood in terms of their purpose. And so what you need to do in order to find the goodness of a thing is you need to find the purpose of a thing. So take anything that you can think of and find its purpose, and then try and determine what kinds of things suit that purpose for that thing. So in the case of a knife, we have the purpose of cutting, and we have the relative sharpness of the knife as the kind of thing that suits the purpose of the knife, right? If the knife is sharp, it is good at cutting. If the knife is dull, then it is bad at cutting. And so now we have a little bit of an understanding here of what it is for something to be good in general, right? Aristotle thinks that, we've got these virtues, these properties or propensities or dispositions that a thing has to be able to function in a certain way well or poorly. And under that kind of way of thinking, we have a grasp on what it is for a thing to be a good or bad version of the kind of thing that it is. Goodness then is having the virtues that are involved in being a good version of the kind of thing that something is, right? So a good knife cuts well, and in order to cut well must have the virtues for a knife of being sharp, having the right size, being not flimsy, too flimsy, etc. And the idea here is supposed to be, this goes for all kinds of things, right? So take a good house versus a not so good house, right? What makes the good house better than the not so good house? What is good for a house? Well, it needs to provide shelter. It needs to provide warmth in the cold. It needs to hopefully provide coolness in the heat, which maybe the cave does better here. But right, I mean, it needs to be able to give you protection in some way from the elements. And so you can think of these kinds of features of a house as the virtues of a house, right? If a house doesn't provide you any protection, that's not a virtue, right, for the house. It's not good. It's not a good making feature of a house if it doesn't provide you any protection. Or maybe think about what makes a good dog, right? Does a good dog have to smile at you and not bark very much? Maybe, but a bad dog is the kind of dog that doesn't listen and doesn't, tears up your furniture, does things that you don't want it to do in certain ways, isn't loyal, bites people, right? Isn't temperate. And we can understand this under the guise of thinking that, what's the point of a dog? A dog is supposed to be man's best friend. That's, in a sense, the purpose of a dog or something like that, right? Maybe not. This starts to get into a more difficult kind of question, like whether or not there are certain kinds of purposes for biological creatures. But, at the very least, the purpose of having a dog can be understood along these lines, right? Why do you want to have a dog? Well, you want to have a dog in order to enjoy having a dog, and you need to. So now there's all these things that go into what it takes to actually enjoy having a dog. And that involves the dog being well-tempered, well-mannered, not destroying your property, not biting the people that come over. Maybe the dog actually does provide you some protection or is able to work in some way, seek out things and help you in certain ways. These are all good-making features of a pup. That is also Joey, by the way, my dog on the left. He's a good boy. But what about humans, right? This is sort of the obvious place to go, right? Where's Aristotle going? Well, we've got this understanding of a notion of goodness for a knife, goodness for a house, goodness maybe for a dog. But what about humans? What could possibly, how does it make sense to think about a good human or a bad person? If we're going to think about these things on Aristotle's view, we have to seek out their function, their purpose. So in a sense here, it seems like we're sort of stuck. We need to now know what the purpose of living a human life is, or the purpose of being human. And that might initially seem like a daunting task because the meaning of life is something that people have been in search of for millennia, and nobody's come down on a nice settled understanding of what it means for life to have meaning or purpose. But Aristotle has a sort of idea here that he doesn't really want to focus on like the specifics of what it is for a human being to have a purpose, but sort of what it is for people in general to have purpose, and to give some kind of general idea of what it probably is, at least in general, what a human being's purpose is or could be. And the way that you do this is you start off by asking yourself or others a question. And the question often goes something like this. I'll just give this little rundown here. It's kind of fun. Like, okay, so what are you doing right now? Well, you're listening to this lecture. Why would you be listening to this lecture? What are you trying to get out of it? What do you want out of the lecture? Well, you want to get some knowledge out of this lecture so that you can, do well on the upcoming midterm. Well, why do you want to do that? Like, why do you want to do well on the upcoming midterm? And then your response should hopefully be because you want to do well in the class. You want to make the professor happy. You want to, you want to get a good grade. And then the questioning continues. Well, why do you want to get a good grade? Probably because you want to have a good GPA. You want to be able to graduate. But why would you want to be able to graduate? Well, in order to have the degree. Why do you want a degree? In order to get a job, a better job than you would be able to have without a degree. Well, why do you want to get a good job? Like, what's the point of having a good job? Well, you need one in order to successfully live a life, right? You need one in order to make money and to move on and to have things that, a successful person might have. Well, why do you want to be a successful person? Why do you want to have all those things? And the response here starts to kind of press towards what Aristotle wants. And it's, well, because I want to be happy. I want to live a full life with all of these things. And I need all of these, I need to be doing all of these things insofar as I'm working towards that. I need a good job and a nice house and people around me that love me in order to live well, in order to be in a good position and be happy. And then finally, you get this further question. Well, why do you want to be happy? And at that point, there shouldn't really be an answer, right? This is the foundation about whatever of what everybody could possibly want from life. Being happy, living fully. What else could there be? What reason could you possibly have to want any of these things beyond these things? They stop the regress of questions here. There's no further question. There's no further reason to be happy. Being happy is something that's worthy and worth pursuing for its own sake. So, like, what is it that, what could possibly be the foundation that everyone in general over the long term wants? Eudaimonia. That's what Aristotle's response is. Obviously, everybody wants eudaimonia. But that's, that doesn't tell you what anything about that means. Eudaimonia is basically, on Aristotle's view, the good life. It's to live in a kind of flourishing, happiness-filled, full life. Happiness, sometimes the term gets defined as happiness, which is slightly problematic just because happiness is a loose term that means often a kind of state of psychological bliss, which, the state would be nice and is nice to have all the time, but it's not the fullness of life, right? I mean, if you could live a life of pure bliss as, like a pig lives in the mud, would you do it? I mean, like, would it, a short, brutish, happy, blissful life? No, that doesn't seem like a good life in the end. And that's why Aristotle, doesn't mean that. What he means is a full, flourishing life, a life where things don't go wrong, where people treat you and you treat other people well. There's no failings in this life on your part. and you've been raised sort of right. You act right, and everything is in its right place. That's the good life for Aristotle. It's this full, flourishing life in which everything goes well. But what do you need for all this to happen, right? What do you need in order to have a good life? Well, fine. Like, this is where we're starting to get on to understanding what it is for Aristotle, what it is to think of a good human person, a good living being, to have a good life, and understanding how Aristotle's theory starts to apply. You need, according to Aristotle, first to get lucky. First, you have to get lucky in order to live a good life. You need things that are outside of your control to happen. You need to be raised in the right kind of way. You need to have enough resources to get by. But those are, in a sense, neither here nor there. Those are the kinds of things that you need in order to live a truly good life, in the sense that nothing actually wrong happens to you. It's really by the luck of the draw that whether or not you are able, on Aristotle's view, to live a truly good life. But there are some things that are within your control, whether or not you sort of you start off you start off well. And those are the virtues. According to Aristotle, you need to cultivate the specifically human virtues, the virtues that specifically make living a human life a good life. But you can ask, like, what are those? What are the specifically good human virtues? What is it that makes a human being a good human being? Well, there are lots of distinctively human virtues, or excellences, that he thinks we must cultivate in order to live well. Just a few here that I like to think of are courage, honesty, or sincerity, prudence, and justice. In understanding these kinds of virtue, we ought to, on Aristotle's view, understand them as a kind of in the middle golden mean between vices. They often can be thought of along this kind of line as existing in the middle. So you can think about virtues as proficiency or propensity at getting things right in between possible extremes, where the extremes would be an extreme deficiency of some feature or an extreme excess of some feature. And here's just two examples. There's obviously this virtue of courage, and the virtue of courage can be thought of along these lines. You don't, in order to be courageous, you need to not have, or you need to have the right amount of fear when certain activities come your way. So I always like to think of this along medieval dragon slayer lines. Imagine you're a knight and there's a dragon that's threatening the castle or the damsel or whoever it is. And it's your job to go fight the dragon. Well, you need to be a courageous knight in order to fight the dragon. And there are really three ways of being. The first way you could be is to be too afraid of the dragon, right? And to never actually go and face it, because, it's an extremely dangerous dragon, and maybe you lack some of the skills to be able to defeat it. Or on the other hand, you could be far too rash. You could have, thrown caution to the wind. You could run out to attack the dragon, maybe get lucky and defeat it, but more likely than not, not actually take into consideration just how dangerous the dragon is, run out and to face it and get burnt to a crisp. Or you could be the courageous knight that knows how dangerous the situation is and takes the proper amount of precaution and feels the proper amount of fear when going to face the dragon. A truly courageous individual would be able to do that kind of thing. Similarly, when it comes to the virtue of honesty, I think there's this difference. There are people that are unhonest, right? They are liars. Maybe former President Donald Trump is one of these people, right? Somebody that purposefully doesn't tell the truth in order to get away with what they want to get away with. But then there's these other people, this sort of other excess of this feature, where they've taken the idea of being truthful so far that they will tell you truthful things when they are unnecessary to tell you, when they are extremely painful or distracting or disturbing. These people have, there's not like a good term for it, but what I call it brutal honesty. Whereas being honest or maybe being sincere does not actually, going overboard like that is not part of the virtue, right? Being virtuously honest involves being honest with yourself, being honest with others, not necessarily, harming others in your honesty. I think this is an interesting kind of idea, especially with respect to bioethics, at least. When thinking about the notion of informed consent and the notion and like what it is that doctors are supposed to do when they tell patients that they have certain kinds of illnesses or what they need to do in certain kinds of situations. Being brutally honest is not the best kind of bedside manner to have. It's not a virtue of almost anyone, right? It's in some sense a vice. Now, according to Aristotle as well, though, being virtuous or having a particular virtue in one way or another along a particular line is great, but you can't ultimately be virtuous or live a fully good life without having all of the virtues and having them sort of unified and acting in concert with them. The virtues are, of course, like relative to themselves to sort of individual abilities. So it's not the case that everyone has to be super courageous or super intelligent, etc. Being different people are built different ways, right? It's not the case that every person has to be so courageous as to be able to fight the dragon, right? This all comes in degrees and is relative to individuals' abilities. But Aristotle does think that there is ultimately a golden mean for individuals and an amount of virtue that is appropriate for every individual person as they are. And then we might ask, well, how is it then that you can actually develop the virtues? How is it that you can try and become virtuous? This seems like it might be rather hard if it's true that you really can't be virtuous without having all of the virtues. And Aristotle suggests that in order to become virtuous, what we need to do is try to emulate moral exemplars, people that are virtuous already, that we see as virtuous, that we see as doing the right things at the right times, in the right situations, for the right reasons, with the right means, right? These are the kinds of, ultimately this theory is very general and does not give us a lot of specifics, but that's the way of thinking about it, is to try and do the right thing at the right time, with the right reason, for the right purpose, aimed at the right goal, with the right tools, right? All of these things, all right, in their right place. So becoming virtuous, though, and like raising children, how does one become virtuous and live a flourishing life? Well, we need to seek out those that we know to be virtuous, and we need to try to emulate them. So we need to think about what those people would do, those virtuous people, and how they might do it, how they would act. In a sense, this is the "what would Jesus do" form of ethics. When you're trying to decide what to do, ask ask yourself who you think is a really good person that would know what to do in that situation, and what they might do, and then pursue that activity, right? And then in order to become virtuous, like, or in order to cultivate a particular virtue, you need to act in that way and be in such a way that you eventually become habituated. You end up acting that way out of mere habit rather than having to think too hard about what it is that you're going to be doing. So ultimately, virtuous actions that you take that are virtuous, is different than being fully virtuous, right? You can do something that is the right thing to do because it's the thing that the virtuous person would have done at the right time, in the right way, at the right place, blah blah blah. While you yourself aren't virtuous, because it's possible for you to have moral failings or virtue failings in other regions while you are doing the right thing in one situation. But in order to become virtuous, ultimately, you have to try to cultivate all the virtues until they become habits or propensities for you to act in certain ways. And the idea here really is like, just think about your own life. Think about the things that are good about your life, and think about the things where you need to work on them, or other, things need to happen a little bit differently. We all suffer in various ways, and it's doubtful that very many of us are actually fully virtuous people. Most of us have our own vices in particular areas. But one of the great things to sort of try to get yourself into, and when thinking about trying to be a good person, is an attempt to try to set yourself up in such a way that you've created habits, you've created propensities to act in very specific ways without having to actually think too hard about how to act in those ways, such that they're the right way to act under the right circumstance, with the right means, to the right people, right? And you've just kind of, you've got this tuned in, and you're doing it. You're kind of humming along, doing the good thing at the right time. That's ultimately Aristotle's kind of thought, is that you can do this. You can create this within yourself, and that's the amount of kind of control that you ultimately have. So even if you're unlucky in the way that you're raised, or in how much means, like money and shelter and food you have, you can still try. You can still try to to cultivate these virtues within yourself, by recognizing where and who has those virtues, and trying to emulate them in such a way that you eventually become habituated. So ultimately, what does it mean when it comes to like raising children? Um, how should we think about raising children on this model? Well, you can think about it in the first place as being as virtuous as you possibly can be, trying to be a virtuous model of morality to your own children. But Aristotle's not going to say that's it, right? Don't just live life virtuously and expect them to pick up on it. Also teach them, right? Also teach them, and teach them to try and emulate others besides yourself, to recognize that you will fail sometimes, and that everyone does. In fact, that seems to be the kind of thing that Aristotle thinks you probably ought to let everyone know. It's a virtue. It's a virtue to let others know that you fail sometimes. And these things too, right? Like Aristotle doesn't think, oh, like each emotion like is always bad. So he doesn't think like, anger is a bad emotion and so you should never be angry. He thinks, no, there are certain circumstances under which it is virtuous to be angry. And namely, those are the circumstances which call for the anger, right? If someone wrongs you in a sufficiently strong way, Aristotle would say you ought to be angry in that case. You ought to be angry up until a certain point. And like, how would the virtuous person react? How would a good person react when being wronged in a certain way? They might be more forgiving than some of us would be normally, but at the very least, I mean, that's not to say that they weren't actually angry in some case. So these are the kinds of things you want to teach your children as well, right? It's an attempt at finding the golden mean, not going overboard in any way, and not being super deficient. It's an attempt to show them how they can and should act, and how not to overact or overreact in particular situations, helping to give them a kind of self-control that is becomes apparent in the person that is fully virtuous. And then, you can attempt to motivate them to be good. You can show them the downfall of people that have fallen victim to vices, or how vices can affect their own lives or other people's lives. And then finally, it's mostly helpful if you can get lucky. I mean, not that you can actually control that at all, but having, being lucky and being good at raising children, being lucky and having children that are have natural proclivities towards being obedient or being self-controlling, having the ability to not do certain things, but then also just, being lucky enough that, you maybe learned from your own parents how to raise a child well. Maybe you had good mentors. Maybe you have, good abilities to choose people to surround your children with, money to send them to good schools, and the like. Oftentimes those things, ultimately, that kinds of means is less and less under our control. Finally, so bringing this entire theory to a bioethical frame, this sort of virtuous model, the virtue theory model, is replicable for all kinds of things, right? We can think of it in terms of how to run a business, how to train for a sport, how to create a product, right? Just think about training for sport. You have a purpose in mind. You have a purpose, and you can distill the kind of virtues that would help you succeed in that purpose. Take, the Olympics or this summer, and in order to get that gold medal, if that's the purpose, right, in a sense, what are the kinds of things that you need to do? Well, you need to train a lot, but you need to train well. You need to train smart. You need to not be injured. You need, there are lots of things that, you don't want to go push yourself too hard, because that will cause injury, but you don't want to not push yourself enough, because then you won't be in the best shape to be able to actually win. We can apply this kind of way of thinking to the healthcare system, and to how to be or act as healthcare practitioners. So when it comes to specific cases, we can, in a way, think about applying this virtue theoretic approach to specific issues in healthcare. And so I just wanted to sort of suggest this. If you're thinking about this kind of way of thinking, and you're writing in your weekly or in your discussion forum post about something, and you're interested in this way of thinking about different kinds of issues. Some issues this way of thinking works better for than others, but some other issues, other kinds of ethical thinking works better for. But you might, try and address or think about how we could address specific kinds of bioethical issues, right? Like how we should take care of cancer patients, or how we should treat cancer in populations, how we might take care of addiction, how should we treat people that are addicts, how can we better serve them, what's the purpose of certain kinds of activities, what's the purpose of certain kinds of attempts to rectify certain injustices. Medical resource distribution seems ripe for this kind of way of thinking. What's the actual purpose of medical resource distribution? Are we trying to distribute things justly or fairly, or where there's greatest need? And then how might we do that under a recognition of what kinds of things are good-making features, are virtues that help successfully accomplish that purpose or goal? And so from the perspective of Aristotle's theory, we might actually really be able to kind of get a better idea, a better general framework for how we can think about what's good and what's bad, and what kinds of things we need to balance and work on all together, right? I mean, if you think about specific versions of, take any aspect of our current healthcare system and think about all of the virtues that need to be kind of cultivated in that system, you're always going to be able to find some deficiencies in certain regions right? And because you're able to find deficiencies in certain regions, like you're able to think, look, the system is not as good as it could possibly be, right? And that's Aristotle's whole idea, is like living a good life involves being a virtuous person, and being a virtuous person involves having all of the virtues. Having all of the virtues is difficult, but you need to cultivate all of them to really live a fully good life. The same thing seems to go for a business or for a particular aspect of some kind of care. This brings us to the end of this lecture, which is, it's nice and short. These, talking about these ethical theories, we can spend more time discussing them in person. But, so virtue ethics is in a way a very general theory. And so insofar as it's so general, it gives you a framework for thinking about morality and ethical sort of value in a lot of ways, but it doesn't really offer a whole lot about what you should do. It just kind of tells you to do what the ethical person is going to do, right? It doesn't tell you why you should do that, or how exactly you should go about that, or who the ethical person really is. It kind of allows you to rely on your own intuitions about which people are good already, which people are, worthy of emulation already. Next time, for the next lecture, we're going to be discussing utilitarianism and deontology, or Kantian ethics, which differ from a virtue ethics approach in that they provide real decision procedures for deciding what to do in almost any given case. And these two theories are often at odds with one another. So the next lecture will be probably a bit longer, because I'll have to be introducing two whole theories and contrasting them. And they ultimately, I think, are often the core of our ethical thinking in the moment, because we often tend to think about ethical decision-making procedures more in the moment and more sort of on-site sort of ethical reasoning. Whereas the virtue ethics approach is kind of more of a way to think about living your entire life, a way of thinking about the entire way that a life might go, and how you should sort of in general try to take things in order to have that life go well, what your sort of goals and plans ought to be, apart from specific ethical thinking. So that brings us to the end of today, and I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and see you next time.